Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Endurance Physios podcast. I'm Dr. Will Gonzaba, joined today, as always, by Dr. Sam Rockwater. How's it going, Sam?
I'm good. How are you?
And doing great, man. I'm super excited today, man, because we finally have our first guest on the show, Jena Brown, a sports dietitian from down here in Texas. So, Jena, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, we've been Sam and I have this like master list of topics that we've been trying to make happen over the past couple months, and we keep saying like, hey, we need to have a guest on the show because like I'm sure people are tired of listening to us. So as we were compiling our list of people we could interview, I was like, Jena would be awesome. So um, instead of introducing you, I will let you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners. So, Jena, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your practice.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm excited to be here. So it's kind of a loaded question there. I think most people like to talk about themselves, but yeah, so professionally, I am a registered dietitian and I'm a certified specialist in sports nutrition or sports dietetics. I own a private practice that's located in Brenham, Texas, and my practice is called Victorum Performance Nutrition. Brenham, if you're not familiar with Texas, it's situated, halfway between Houston and Austin. So it's a nice little hub for endurance. People like to come out here and train, especially on our hills. So it's a great place to be. But outside of my professional role, I am first and foremost, I always introduce myself as I'm a wife and a mom of four. So my kids are anywhere ranging from 8 to 15. So that means outside of my private practice, I'm super busy. Not a lot of free time going on over here. But
Full mom
in
life.
short, yes. Okay. I didn't know if
Mhm.
Sam had kids. I knew Will obviously had kids, but it's a little busy. Yeah, so what I do is I help endurance athletes with all things nutrition and hydration. So this will be your daily nutrition and daily hydration. And then separately, we have our race nutrition and or training nutrition, whichever you want to call it, and training and racing hydration. On top of that, I do a variety of testing and supplement advisory, so to speak, on how to support your health and your training. So it's not just about our performance, but also about our health. So I encompass all of that.
Yeah,
But
very awesome.
yeah, yeah.
So, so Jena and I got to know each other. So our practices are they're like hour and a half apart ish where we live,
Yeah,
2 hours, hour and a half. And so Jena, about once a quarter or
without a
so, will
rest.
come. Yeah, we'll come. Well, yeah, without a wreck, we'll come down to San Antonio and do presentations at our practice on various nutrition topics, all kind of around endurance sports, and those are open to our community. They can come in and just learn on whatever the topic it is. So, with all of us working in the endurance space in some way, there are a ton of myths out there across the board with like everything training, but especially nutrition. And so what our goal is today is to really dive into a few of what a few of these really common myths are. And hopefully Jena can help us make better sense of these things and know what is real and the practices that we should have in our daily training and our daily lives as well. So with that being said, I think we should just dive into the first myth. So this one's on hydration. And this is something that I actually learned from you during a presentation that you did at Almost Park Physio. But this is on daily hydration. So most people and athletes think that they should hydrate with water during the day until they start peeing clear. And usually that's the indication like, okay, cool. Like I'm good to go. I'm well hydrated. I'm ready to go train. But I learned from you that might not always be the case. So can you kind of shed some light onto that?
Yeah, that's perfect. I love how you frame that through daily hydration. Because, like I said, daily hydration is separate from, our training or racing hydration. But I think it's just one of those things that, the message that usually gets across is that we should drink more water and not and avoid sodium or electrolytes, especially sodium. So, this isn't necessarily bad advice. There are a lot of people who aren't drinking enough water, but you can drink too much. And so, normally where I'll start is telling people, okay, aim for half your body weight in ounces. So if you're 140 pounds, aim for 70 ounces of fluid. So that's not just water. That would be your coffee, your tea, milk, water, whatever fluid. That's a good starting place. But outside of that, we kind of monitor based on our urine color. So we don't want clear pee. We want light lemonade. So I say no clear pee. We want to avoid clear. We want to avoid apple juice color. But yeah, so electrolytes, that's the other kind of issue there, is that most of us think we shouldn't include salt in our diet. That is not true for a lot of us who are losing a lot of sweat in our training sessions. Maybe somebody who isn't, exercising a whole lot. But yeah, we definitely don't want clear pee for sure.
Mhm.
Jenna, are those
Yeah,
recommendations
I know.
different for like endurance athletes?
You mean so you mean daily
Like,
hydration and water in general, or what are you referring to specifically?
yeah, sorry, I should have been more specific. So like, take for example, like I live in Arizona, so we live in the desert. Obviously a very dry
Mm.
climate. When you start looking at like endurance athletes, I feel like, especially in the summer, as soon as I wake up, I'm starting to sweat. But
Mhm.
but for those endurance
Tempest too.
athletes, like the fluid intake, is that different like in different climates? Is it different like with endurance athletes versus the general public? Like, can you shed some light on that as well?
Well, yes and no. I mean, daily hydration is kind of the same across the board. So if I know somebody, and obviously, if I'm speaking to an endurance athlete and if they're telling me about their tendencies of maybe, clear urine or heat intolerance or something like that, a lot of times I'll say that first water bottle that you drink include an electrolyte. So while I'm saying yes, include electrolytes, include sodium, that doesn't mean we have to do it all day, every day. But we can't really backtrack out of dehydration, which is the biggest point during racing, too, right?
Mhm.
Like once you're dehydrated, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, let me try to make up for lost time. It doesn't work that way. So the goal is always to begin whatever it is, your day, your training session, your race, hydrated. So again, that 50% body weight is just a starting point for fluid. The more muscle mass you have, the more you may need. Obviously, the more training you're doing, the more fluid you're going to need. That's a separate compartment when I work with fluid loss during training. So we'll compartmentalize that individually. But yeah, for daily hydration, it's not necessarily different. Begin the starting point, which may not be enough. We can adjust that depending on your urine color. But aim for half your body weight in fluid. And if from drinking that much fluid, your urine color is clear, then I'm going to say, okay, we need to back off on the water and or fluid, total fluid, and add some electrolytes. If we have apple juice colored urine, then I'm going to say, okay, add more fluid. And depending, we may need to add like a oral rehydration solution, like a liquid IV type product,
Hmm.
to rapidly rehydrate you. So also including electrolytes. There's a lot of different
Nice. Yeah,
nuances to hydration. So
sure. I don't know, just from like that one bit of advice of like taking in more electrolytes during the day, or just I pretty much just took that when you presented it a couple months ago, and I just added like a Gatorade or some scratch mix to one of my water bottles during the day. I wasn't really picky. Whatever I had on hand is what I used. And I was surprised so much by two things. One was how much better I felt during the day. So I would either have it like first thing in the morning or after lunch. So like as I was drinking my coffee, I would sip on that, or I would just have it with my lunch, and I would feel so much more awake and refreshed with that addition. And then I was super surprised with how well I felt going into my workouts, having more electrolytes on board and not hitting the electrolytes for the first time after a really hot and
Yeah.
humid run. So I felt so much better with that.
Yeah, and to Sam's point about Arizona, so Texas, well, I've never trained in Arizona, but I can tell you it's really hot and humid in Texas.
Mhm.
So probably very similar. I've driven through Arizona on our way to Colorado, which is a whole different hydration strategy. But anyway,
That'd actually
um,
probably be a good
but yeah,
topic. Is like hydration strategies when traveling to a race, because like you have to manage like going to the bathroom and all that
yes. Oh my
stuff.
gosh. Yeah.
Yes,
We went
100%,
skiing. I
especially at
won't go
elevation.
down that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that whole trip, I was going through our cabin. I'm like, lemonade pee, guys. And the only one that didn't follow my recommendation was Dad, and he ended up in the ER when we got back to Texas, diagnosed with dehydration.
Oh no,
Classic
So,
dad move.
no.
yeah, he said it was the
Oh,
most expensive bottle of Gatorade he'd ever had. Oh, goodness.
that's
That
funny.
that
Yeah.
So, but
Um,
yeah,
well, I think
Will, to your point there, video is going, okay. To your point there about drinking Scratch or Gatorade, that is one option. And depending on what you need, that's a fuel, but also an electrolyte. And then we have other products that are just electrolytes, like Liquid IV, Element, maybe. That one's pretty salty. Not everybody really needs
mhm.
that, but there's a lot of different options for electrolytes.
So on that topic of like different hydration products, one of the things, this is kind of like a sub myth, but I feel like in the endurance community, like some of the mainstream products like Gatorade or Powerade, like they kind of get a bad rep. And I know from you, like some of the little tidbits you've given me, like, so Jenna has also done some of my pre-race nutrition, and that has helped me massively. But one of the things she recommended was like a morning Gatorade, and from the carbs I think that were in it, and probably from the electrolyte standpoint as well. And
Yeah.
I've always liked using it because it's readily available. It's kind of everywhere, and I like it. But from that standpoint, like products that are more readily available, like the Gatorades, the
Yes.
Powerades, things like that, like is there a place for that in endurance sports, and are they rightly do they rightly have a bad rep in the endurance world?
No, I think they have a great place. Now, I would say they used to be kind of standard, but they're not one and the same. So that's where, you can get into some trouble. So, that when I gave you that plan, which was kind of a little last minute there, I kind of hesitated putting Gatorade in there because I thought, well, I don't know if he's used to Gatorade. So, insert whatever sport drink you may be used to. So, when I'm writing like custom hydration plans and fueling plans, it's always around what is that athlete used to. And if we're training with Gatorade or Gatorade Endurance, then that's perfectly fine. Now, I personally am a fan of Gatorade. Now, um, there are certain types of Gatorade, for example, like I'm always saying, well, choose one without food dye, for example. The formula is still the same, but in general, I'm going to say choose one without food dye. So I'll go for like Glacier Cherry, for example.
Mhm.
Powerade is kind of basically the same on the label, except if you look at the ingredients, high fructose corn syrup is the first ingredient, which I definitely do not love. So if I had to pick one over the other, I would definitely choose Gatorade over Powerade. Um, and I don't know if Powerade has a dye-free version or not, but I generally don't recommend it just because of the high fructose corn syrup. Gatorade, of course, is still going to be a processed food, or well, so to speak, a processed sport product, I guess you can say. And then there's Gatorade Endurance. So that one has higher sodium, different types of carbs, but same amount of carbs. So it just depends on what you're training for. A lot of times I will, again, compartmentalize our hydration and our fuel, meaning our carbs. So sometimes I don't recommend Gatorade because maybe we're using an electrolyte fluid as one part, and then our fuel and carbs maybe are coming from a gel or whatever. It depends on what kind of race we're doing, what kind of fuel we're going to use. So no, Gatorade definitely, and sports drinks definitely have a place in the endurance space.
I have a off the cuff question here. So, last 2 years ago, I started making my own like electrolyte mix. Do you ever
Yeah.
recommend that for people? Because like I would use glucose and fructose and then a little bit of like sodium bicarb to like calm it down a little bit.
Yeah,
But like, do you ever recommend or
for
have you
sure.
recommended that?
I do recommend it, and I make it for my kids sometimes. But what it comes
Nice.
down to is how much work are you willing to put in. So some people have the
Fair.
time and are willing to put in the work to make their own, and that's great. I love that. But sometimes it just comes down to a logistic thing where, if we're talking about making our own hydration product, and if you're racing with that, what does that look like going into a race that maybe you're traveling for? All of it's manageable. It just really comes down to how much work you want to put into it. But yeah, that's fantastic. Sometimes you may do that on training sessions, but then have something that you can purchase for racing. As long as we're practicing it, it's fine. But sometimes the logistics of race day, homemade, may not be the most practical. So,
Yeah, definitely can be
I've got a
challenging, and
story about
also
making your own.
traveling. Sure.
mhm.
I was gonna say traveling. White powder TSA doesn't normally like white powder that's glucose
Yeah.
and fructose that's
No.
labeled in gram increments either. They're not normally a fan of
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But
I know. I kind of ran into that with my salt capsules.
Have you,
they're
have you
like,
guys? I don't know
I don't
about
know about
this.
that.
Have y'all read the book,
I
The
always
No
kind of
Meat
joke
Athlete?
that, when I'm running like I do a lot of running, like in town. And so I'll have my little baggies and my white capsules, in my pockets and whatnot. And I just think it'd be really funny to drop it and somebody pick it up. And
just be like, what is
it's
this?
questionable. Yeah.
I tried to make my own electrolyte mix once. I was following a recipe from the No Meat Athlete cookbook that was really popular, and he's got like this electrolyte recipes, and I think they all involve, is it apple cider vinegar, something like that? I think that's what it
Oh,
was. They all have that, a lot of that in it. And I just mixed this thing up, whatever it called for. And I didn't taste it before I went out on a ride. And I remember it was like a hot,
oh
hot
no.
day. And I just took a big old swig of that, and I thought I was going to vomit immediately. And I was like, oh, this is terrible. So I'm
Hey,
not going down that route.
and I will say, on that note, I made it for my kids because the reason why was because we were out of sports drinks and they were at a hot soccer camp in the middle of summer in Texas. So, I show up and I'm thrilled and I hand over this mason jar of sport drinks. And afterwards, my child was like, "Don't ever do that again, Mom." They were
That's all
so embarrassed.
moonshine style. I like
It's
this.
awesome.
I think you should have your own hydration mix that you sell in in mason jars. That would be badass.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
That'd
I
be
mean,
awesome. That'd be awesome.
That would be
I do
awesome.
all kinds of weird stuff with food and fluid. It doesn't bother me, but the kids,
Oh,
it's
Oh
fun.
man, it's funny.
oh, that's awesome. All right, let's go to the second myth. Um, if you're ready for it. And it's essentially if you're trying to cut weight during a training block, the myth is that it's okay to be in a calorie deficit. Can you kind of talk about calorie deficits and like trying to cut weight and how exactly you would go about it, or shed some light on that topic in general? I think there's a
For sure. So one of the things I clue into a lot is just language and how things are worded. So for example, when I hear cutting weight, my mind goes to, okay, that means losing body fat, right? So you're cutting body fat.
yeah.
Versus other people say, well, I want to lose weight. And I'm like, okay, well, let's reframe that. That means lose fat and either maintain our muscle mass or increase muscle mass. So I always try to define what that means, or at least try to get some clarity when somebody says something like that. Okay, so cutting weight during a training block, well, it's going to depend if that training block is during a training block leading up to a race or key session. So no, we're never going to perform at our best if we're in a calorie deficit. it would be something like, and I'm always thinking of weird kind of correlations or examples. Sometimes I think about it like we're from Texas and we road trip to Colorado. If we were leaving, excuse me, on a road trip to Colorado, we wouldn't fill our gas tank halfway. Like it wouldn't make sense, right? We have to fill up our gas tank so we can get as far as we can. It's the same thing in our body. We cannot go as far as long at the same intensity if we're in a calorie deficit. So what a calorie deficit looks like is going to depend on each person. So there's a lot of endurance athletes who could benefit from a health perspective and possibly a performance perspective if they quote cut some body fat. Depending on how much that individual needs to lose will depend on what size that calorie deficit is and if we're in a training like leading up to an event. So there are ways to do it. There's smart ways to do it. I highly recommend it's under the guidance of a sports dietitian and definitely not leading up to a race that you care about your performance. So if you're going, or if you're just participating in an event and just to participate for fun. So I've done races where like all I want is the medal. I'm not going to go, do anything fancy. Still wouldn't recommend a calorie deficit. But what I mean is I'm not going to go in there with the intention or the mindset that I'm trying to, set a PR or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of people will kind of get, they'll do their base training and then they'll kind of get into it and they'll be like, oh man, I feel like, if I could lose 5 more pounds, I would race so much faster, and yeah, exactly. I hear that and cringe as well. Especially too, we get it. I know Will and I get it from the strength training side from, strength training athletes. And they're like, I don't want to put on more muscle because I'm going to be heavier and I'm not going to perform as well. And I feel like it's a lot of the same thing, right? And I really like that analogy that you made about like if you're going to go on a road trip, you're going to fill your gas tank up all the way to start, right? And not necessarily just, halfway and then, try and.
Right. It just doesn't work, right? Yeah, there's so many different analogies we could put in there, but anyway.
Yeah.
I like that one.
I'm wondering. One of the things that I've seen is I've got a fair amount of, I'd say, senior endurance athletes, so people that are over 65, and I definitely think in a handful of these, the conditions that I'm seeing them for are because they don't have adequate enough fueling, like they don't eat as much.
Right.
And some of them it is because they're trying to control their weight, but other ones is that, hey, as I've gotten older, like I just am not as hungry anymore. Like I just don't. I feel like my appetite has decreased, even though they're like still fairly active. Like they're still going to put in 7 to 9 hours a week of training. And so I'm wondering, is that a thing? Like as they get older, like your appetite kind of suppresses, even if your activity level is still high? And then two, like what are some strategies for that? Because obviously, like in my opinion, some of these people don't have enough fueling to help them do what they want to do.
That's a really great point. So in my mind, first of all, if somebody's coming in for PT, I'm guessing some sort of injury, right? Like, okay, under fueling, right?
Yeah.
That's the first thing that comes to mind. And I always said to you, well, ideally people were coming to you before an injury, but most people don't do that. So, if they're already in for PT because of an injury, that's already a red flag. But you're right. We're seeing a lot of older endurance athletes, which is really great. I love that. But there's a lot of other things that we need to consider, and eating enough to support our training is first and foremost, because as we get older, we start breaking down, like losing muscle mass, like that happens. And so training also contributes to that. And usually we're participating in some form of physical activity because we believe it's beneficial to our health. That's one reason. But sometimes it can kind of be counterproductive there. And loss of appetite, yes, that is normal around a lot of athletes. And sometimes I kind of have a little bit of tough love and I'll say, well, I ask athletes to eat even if you're not hungry. We kind of have to override that intuition. But at the same time, sometimes loss of appetite is an indication of low energy availability. So
Mm.
sometimes I call this, do we have enough money to pay our bills? Okay. So it costs a lot of money to run all the different processes in our body, including our training. And over time, if we're not giving our body what it needs, things will kind of start slowing down. Like, well, you know what? I'm not going to ask you to feed me because you're not going to feed me anyway. We're going to start seeing
Mm.
injuries. So now we're in PT. We Younger female athletes, I always like to highlight, for example, if we lose our menstrual cycle, that's an indication that we don't have enough money to pay our bills. So to answer your question, lack of appetite is partly because of as we get older, that's one thing. It's also common in just athletes in general. And it could be a sign of underfeelings. There's a lot of
Mm.
different things going on potentially that are going on there, or all of the above. So
So it
that's where I
sounds like,
come in.
yeah, gotcha. So it sounds like if you come across that's definitely a sign that like they should get intervention past that. So maybe like professional help and guidance when they're just like, oh, like I know I'm just like not hungry. That
Right.
for like guys like Sam and I, that should be a good thing to like cue in on, like, oh, hey, there's probably some more under the surface that needs to be sorted out.
For sure. It's definitely a possibility. And especially just with culture, diet culture, kind of grooming all of us to eat less, move more kind of thing. Hunger kind of has a negative connotation where, oh, I shouldn't feel hungry, or I shouldn't, kind of that language there around it. So there's a lot of layers to that.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll hop into myth number three because I feel like this kind of goes hand in hand with it. But I'd love to get your thoughts on intermittent fasting and endurance athletes, or working out in fasted states. I think that
Mhm.
this is also kind of a trendy thing. Like you can see some YouTubers, like a vegan cyclist who talks a lot about it, and he's done that personally. And I know on my Strava, I feel like every day there's like, if anybody does a workout that's fasted, they always have to put the title of their ride and then definitely note that it was in a fasted
Fasted.
state, almost if it's like a bragging point, which
Sure.
I don't know enough to judge it or not. So why I am turning it over to you for your input on intermittent fasting and working out in fasted states. Is there anything to that?
Yeah. So my approach to this is always like, hey, with anything that we hear and read, there's often always some layer of truth. So there are benefits to intermittent fasting. There are benefits to working out in a fasted state. But what's missing there is the context. So, you know, one, intermittent fasting is extremely relative. What you call intermittent fasting is maybe different than what I call intermittent fasting. Eating window is maybe a better word that or term that I like to use. So there's that kind of piece of it. You mentioned in reference to a male that a YouTube Instagram, I think you said,
Yeah,
or
YouTuber.
YouTuber. So that's the other thing too, is males versus females is a completely different story. Females, we have hormone cycles that males do not experience. So are we talking about a female or a male? Are we talking about a perimenopausal woman or a younger girl? What is the nature of our workout? So going into a lower intensity, shorter session in a fasted workout, maybe not such a big deal. But are we trying to go and do some training intervals? Are we trying to do a super high intensity, long duration? Are we leading up to a race? There's all kinds of context that's missing. So I definitely work around all kinds of different schedules. In general, the general statement for an endurance athlete is, if we're talking about performance and long term, then the general answer is no, intermittent fasting and fasted workouts are not going to be the most beneficial. But again, there's context and there may be places where that's appropriate, and may not be harmful or detrimental to your training or performance. So that's a tough one to kind of answer because there's a lot of missing details.
I feel like it's very individualized. So, I've messed around with it because it's in the news, and what are you going to do? You're going to try it, right? And try it out a
Yeah.
little bit. I know, so I swam in college. I know that if I did not have something before our morning practice, that practice would be absolutely trash. Because it was such high intensity and stuff like that. So even like something like, I was a broke college student, so I got the off-brand Chewy bars, just something to like, some sort of like carb just to get something in, is what I used. But I know too, I'll wake up and in Arizona, it gets very hot in the summer, like 115 degrees hot. And so your window to ride is from about 4 a.m. to 6, maybe 7 a.m. before it gets above 110. And so you have to wake up and go. And obviously, if you're waking up at 4 a.m. to go for a ride, you're not really super excited about stuffing your face full of food. But I know that that's something that I have like experimented with and I've tried to like do more of, because I noticed that I definitely feel better when I'm fueled, or at least have a little bit of fuel on board before I go out for that ride, versus, even like a zone 2 easy ride, and I'm going out there fast and I just feel like trash. But that's maybe just
Yeah,
me. I don't
that's
know if that.
yeah, and that kind of goes back to the homemade sports drink versus the pre-made, right? So sometimes there's a matter of logistics. For you, for an early morning bike ride, it's different than somebody going out for an early morning run. So we're able to
Yeah.
fuel differently on a bike. We can tolerate more than if we're running and jostling our stomach. So there's kind of that
Yeah.
piece too. But yes, you're absolutely right. If we're waking up at 4 a.m. and we're using a quote 2-hour race or, training breakfast, whatever you want to call it, pre-workout breakfast, I'm not going to ask anybody to wake up at 2 to go eat their breakfast. There's workaround to all of that. And the other thing too is a lot of, or two other things is when I hear of athletes intermittent fasting or working out fasted, I always kind of like pay attention to the language around that conversation too, because a lot of times the reason why people kind of tinker with that idea is really because it's coming from like a restrictive mindset and, well, I'm training, but I'm actually trying to lose weight.
Yeah.
And so therefore I'm going to intermittent fast. And so you try to figure out like what is the root behind why we're tinkering with that. And the other piece of that too is I think maybe what you didn't say, but probably have heard, is that it can help improve fat metabolism. And I think that what gets lost there is normally what we're talking about is during like burning fat during endurance, we're really talking about intramuscular fat, not somebody who's trying to lose weight and talking about like
Not
that
belly fat.
subcutaneous. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
training fasted is inflammatory to our body, training in general. So if we're underfueled, intentionally or not, that creates inflammation and creates stress, which actually contributes to that body fat and the external body fat that you see. Anyway, there's just a lot behind all of that. So,
I've had this conversation actually with a few different athletes, and we talk about cortisol and different other like stressors and the total amounts of stressors, and they get really frustrated because they're like, man, I feel like I'm just getting pudgier, during training and stuff like that. And oftentimes, they're so stressed out, they're doing maybe intermittent fasting, they're doing maybe other things where they're just so stressed and they're under fueling that their body is just like, okay, survival mode, and that's pretty much it. But
yeah.
um
Yeah.
and I think
Tough
that
one too, because if I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
no, oh, if you had something else to add, go for it.
Well,
All
I
right.
was just gonna say, when people see that and, oh my gosh, I am getting a little pudgier, the response tends to be, well, I'm gonna eat less, which creates more stress in the body.
Yeah, then it
So
just
it's kind
becomes a
of
negative
a
cycle.
downward.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's move to myth number 4, shall we? How, and I have a whole bunch of questions around this too, but I'll start with just a couple to start. But essentially, the myth is um, recovering manage meal or recovering or managing recovery meals. Excuse me. When is it okay to eat anything like junk food, like whatever they want? Right? Oh my gosh, I just went out for a hard ride. Like, I know I'm a huge ice cream fan. That's kind of my crutch, especially in the summer. And so I'll be like, oh yeah, I deserve a Dairy Queen Blizzard on my drive home, from this hard ride. So when is it okay to have junk food versus when should you really prioritize like
Yeah. Great one. So honestly, if I hear language around like, oh, I earned this, I can eat anything I want, that's a key of some form of restriction, right? So the idea is when I'm working with athletes and just regular individuals too, but having that kind of emotional response where we look at a food and kind of label it as a good food, a bad food, junk food, quote, healthy food, that tells me that something's off. So I don't really have a problem, so to speak, with junk food. There's ingredients that I don't love and stuff like that, but it's not a food. I don't target specific foods. If we have these mindsets around like binging off of a certain type of food, regardless if it's junk food or not, then that just gives me a clue into their fueling. So there's that kind of piece of it. If you come off of a ride or a training session or whatever it is, and with the mindset that I earned this, then I know where to kind of go through and intervene with your nutrition. As far as when should we prioritize protein and carbs, typically I actually target protein over carbs, even though technically, as endurance athletes, we're using more carbs, right, as a fuel source. The reason why I target protein is just because it tends to get a little bit lost in translation and under prioritized. Um, so we need protein after a training session, especially a long session and a high intense session, to start rebuilding our muscles. So if our thought is to target maybe those high carb quote junk foods, it's not going to give you the same amino acids to start rebuilding your muscles. So timing is going to depend on a lot of things. It just depends on how long was that session? Did we have fuel before it? What was in that fuel before it? All kinds of different things.
all
Everything
right.
is a long answer and it's
Yes.
individual. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. So for those, I mean, I would like to give the audience and some listeners some like general ideas, right? Like earlier, I know you mentioned, half your body weight in ounces for daily hydration. That's awesome. That gives us something to like shoot for. What normally would you say like
Yes.
post in terms of like grams of protein? What would you say is
Yeah,
like a good
great. So without
estimate?
knowing your body weight, right? And as well, we've done a presentation on protein. It's really based on your body weight, how much I tell somebody to eat. But if I don't know and I'm making a general statement, I'm going to say 20 to 40 grams. Okay, that should encompass most people. If I say, okay, aim for 20 to 40 grams of protein after your session. If you're in a calorie deficit, if you are intentionally or not, right? Like if you're trying to lose body weight and we're not training for an event, so we're intentionally in a calorie deficit. If we're older, so older athletes, older individuals, we're all going to aim up to that higher side. But yeah, 20 to 40 grams is a great target for most people. And that could be the size of the palm of your hand if that's real food, like a piece of chicken or, a hamburger patty, something like that. Or if you're reading a label, that's pretty easy to identify how much 20 grams of protein is.
All right, another question. Sorry, I keep asking questions. I feel also too like I'm kind of being
Great.
exposed here a little bit because I'm asking all my own questions as well. But in terms of like protein, what are your thoughts on like protein shakes and protein recovery drinks and stuff like that? Obviously, there's a huge variety in the quality of protein and the different types of protein, whey protein, and other protein types. What are your thoughts on those? Is there something to look for? Like different type of protein to look for, or what would you?
Yeah, I think protein shakes can be extremely helpful. The tricky part is finding some that really are, quote, cleaner than others. So, usually what I'll kind of say this as, for example, okay, and not to throw anybody under the bus, okay, but people are probably familiar with Core Power, right? It tastes really good if you haven't tried it. Okay.
It tastes
Fairlife Core
wonderful.
Power. It's a great.
Yes.
Yes, it does. And it has a lot of
It's probably
protein,
not
which
good
I
for you.
love. Okay. What I don't love is that it has artificial sweeteners. Okay. But at the same time, if I'll say something like, well, if your option is Core Power or nothing, then that's a really great option. So it's always context too on what do you
Sure.
have available kind of thing. Same thing with fluid. I'll say the same. Well, is so food dye. I targeted food dye, and I said, well, okay, if your option is Gatorade with food dye or no fluid, Gatorade with food dye is your best option, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So outside of that, depending on what you have access to, we're going to look for, like I said, protein drinks that preferably don't have artificial sweeteners. I'm going to look for something without food dye and other, I'll look at the protein source depending on if you are plant-based or if you don't, animal-based, whatever kind of protein preference you have. So that's another consideration, but I think that they can definitely fill a gap if you are in a place where logistically it doesn't make sense. So again, coming off of a race, maybe we're packing something portable, but if you're ending your session at home, then, we don't have to have that portable protein drink unless that you're just not willing to cook or prepare something else. So
Remember
Thank you
asking
for
about those
answering
core
all my
powers
personal
during
questions.
yeah.
That's what
You
I
can
feel bad
schedule a
when
session.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe
when
I
Jenna comes
have
to do her
I should.
when Jenna comes to do her presentations, I feel bad for her because that's like all it turns into is everyone is asking like their individual thing. But it's good. You learn so much because I remember I asked you about the core powers. I was all about those, like pretty much one a
Yeah.
day. And she was like, "Yeah, no, artificial sweetener." And I was like, "Damn, like they're so good though."
Well,
But then you recommended
it's
the
just not
Chobani
my
Complete.
preference.
Well, but now
Yeah,
I
I love
prefer
Chobani
drinking the Chobani
Complete.
Complete because it's cheaper, it's less fluid. I can, it's cheaper and tastes good. So that's great. It's
Yeah.
20 grams of
But
protein still.
if we talk about practicality though, so it has to be refrigerated. So
True.
if you need to pack it, that's something to think about.
Mhm.
And I'm one of those. Of course, I'll go through all the hoops, and I had all my refrigerated protein ready when I come off of a race, but I pack it into a little cooler that fits in my race bag and all this good stuff. And so it depends on how much work you're willing to put into it.
Oh, I'll pack a cooler. No problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll have protein shakes
It
and
is
beers
difficult
for
to
Will.
find.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
1 and 1. Oh man.
Yes.
I think what you said though at the beginning of this is like when Sam is mentioning his Dairy Queen cravings and stuff like that, and just for all of us, I think we all kind of have our own craving, and that we should kind of examine that a little bit more because you're right, in some ways that is a restrictive mindset, and so maybe like that our daily nutrition needs some more examining in other ways too, because I think as athletes, like there, and probably most people, like we all label food as like, hey, that's something that you have to earn to have that, and that's probably not like, I mean, it's not healthy to have that type of mindset around food.
Definitely
So I
not
think
healthy.
you saying that is really, really powerful. Yeah, really powerful because I'm
Yeah,
definitely guilty of that too. I've got a candy drawer
that's a big
upstairs and it's
piece.
just only after a workout, one piece of candy. Otherwise, don't even look at that.
Right. No, that's a big piece of what I work on with my athletes. It's just that mindset, and they're just it doesn't have to be that way. And
Yeah.
if you crave cookies or ice cream or whatever, let it be what it is. It's totally fine. There doesn't need to be any kind of emotion behind that. Oh, I shouldn't have that, but I want it. Um, recognize and say, okay, that's great. Here's the ice cream or cookie or candy, and then ask yourself why. Like, what could I have done differently? How could I have fueled differently, either during the day or during your session, or a combination of the two? um but yeah, it's usually an indication of something, so
I was
it's
about
not
to ask you
about
that.
labeling.
Yeah, I was about to
Hmm.
ask you that. Like, is the indication of like craving something sugary, what regardless of what it is? I mean, is that an indication that you're not getting something in your diet in the
Yeah.
day to day? Interesting.
Yeah, two things. So it's either an indication that you simply need more calories, right? And so our body knows that we get very quick energy from carbohydrates. So it's kind of a survival mechanism, right? I'm going to crave what I know will give me fast energy because I need food. And if I tell Will that I need carbs, then hopefully he will give that energy to me. And then sometimes too, it could just be lack of blood sugar control. So
Mm.
if we're somebody who is constantly chasing the sugar, then that's going to be a case of, or constantly chasing or craving sugar. It's probably a case of we're always overshooting. So, we come up with our brain says, I need carbs. And so we binge on said carb, and then we come back down. And then pretty soon after that, we crave it again. But a lot of times with, well, when I'm doing meal planning and helping with individual plans, blood sugar control outside of our training is always built into the process. So if we're still experiencing those cravings, then I know something's not right. So let's look at what we're fueling. Now, there's sometimes a gap between what I'm recommending them fuel and then what they're actually taking in. So let's talk about that and figure out, are you actually taking in what is on your plan, kind of thing. So all kinds of different things there.
Yeah, cool. But very, very interesting to like, again, just the realization like there's more to that craving.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, all right. Well, so I know that these were some myths that Sam and I came up with, and I kind of felt in some ways strange, like coming up with the nutrition myths. But because like you're the expert, like you live it, you see all the things that people come to you with. So, is there anything else that you want to add to this list, or any other myths you want to debunk?
Oh man. I mean, I really thought you did a great job coming up with these highlights. And one of the things I heard you say in one of your episodes was, when it comes to like, well, I call them like nutrition sound bites, right? I have a difficult time putting blanket recommendations out there because, like I said earlier, there's just always context.
Hmm.
So it's challenging to put information out there when it's like, well, that's true, but it may not be true for you. And so it's, at the end of the day, it's extremely individualized. Of course, I'm going to say that, right? Because I work individually. Um, but
No, we get it.
there's a
'Cause
lot of different answers for each person.
we
So,
get it because we live the same thing in the PT world, and I think so many people love to ask, and social media doesn't help this because everything is advertised as
yeah,
the one exercise to fix your knee pain, or the
right.
one diet that's going to make you faster and lose
Yes.
weight.
Yes.
And in our world, I
Yes.
always deal with that. It's like I hate being asked, "Hey, can you give me?" If for someone I don't know, right, or just, and they don't mean anything by it, but like, "Hey, can you give me some exercises for my knee pain?" It's like, well, I can, but like I don't know anything about it. I have no context at all. Like I have to
Yes.
evaluate you to figure out what's going on, because what I give for one is not the same as the other, and nutrition is no
Exactly.
different. So I totally get that. Like it's really hard to give blanket statements.
It
Um,
is.
but regardless of that, I think you give like when you do the presentations with us and today, like so much good framework, and at least ideas for when people need to be investigating things further and looking into things further, rather than just thinking that these generalized blankets are okay for everybody, right? So
Right.
I think it's still
Right.
super helpful, the information that you give out.
Awesome. Awesome.
Um, All right, so you kind of alluded to this, but so Jenna, tell us. So you have your practice in Texas. Tell us what are some of the ways that people can work with you. So what are like some of the services that you offer, and how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, my practice is in Texas. Technically, I work across the United States online. But I really love to kind of protect that in-person option. So that's definitely a big piece of my practice, which is why I travel out to different places to kind of increase availability. But yeah, you can work with me online or in person, whether I'm coming to you or you're coming to my office in Brenham, Texas. My website is victorum.com. So victorum is Latin for victory or winner. People are always kind of a little bit perplexed what that is, but victorem.com. And then social media, I'm working on that. My handle is at Victorum Nutrition. And service wise, I work for, I create custom meal plans. So that's going to be your daily nutrition planning. And then I do your race nutrition planning, which can also be your training nutrition. Um, Sometimes we do multiple plans if we're just tired of our plan, or if we're training for different races and want to use different products on the course. I offer hydration testing. So that is sweat sodium testing through precision hydration. And then we'll do sweat volume testing also. And then lab testing. There's all kinds of services. Supplement
Cool.
advisory. I do a lot of education on supplements. So there's just a lot of different
Nice.
services available.
That's awesome. It's all super helpful. So Sam, any last thoughts from you, man?
No, I thought this was extremely personally beneficial, but hopefully other people got some other things out of it too. Like you were saying, Will, I think it's really challenging, right? Like, the amount of people who come up to me, oh, what do you do? Oh, you're a therapist. Oh, well, my shoulder's been hurting. Is there one exercise? And you're right. It's a blanket statement, right? And so, okay, try some rotator cuff stuff. Maybe it'll clear it up. Maybe it won't. But at least it's a start, and at least it's something to get them thinking about it, and something to get people actually aware of it. Which I know in therapy, and I'm sure in nutrition, is probably very similar. But yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, Jenna. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for sharing your knowledge. I think I have about 50 other questions, but we'll save it for possibly another episode where we can kind of dive maybe a little
Yeah.
bit deeper into a topic.
You're so
Yeah.
welcome. Great.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. You were an excellent first guest, and I hope that you can come back and we can dive like more nerdy into certain topics.
Yeah, I
Well,
love it. I could talk all day, so I appreciate it.
awesome. Well, thank you everybody for listening. I hope y'all found this information helpful. And if there's other nutrition topics that y'all want us to cover in the future, let us know in the comment section. We would love to address whatever concerns or questions that you guys have in the future with Jenna's help. We always appreciate the listen, y'all, and we would always appreciate a review of the podcast and a share and a download of our podcast wherever you are listening to it. And before we sign off, Sam, do you want to let people know where they can find you and follow you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. The best place is Instagram, and I'm at The Endurance.
Awesome. And you can contact me at my company's website. That's at Almost Park Physio on Instagram, or at my personal Instagram. That's at Will Gonzaba. Thank you guys for the listen. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll be back again next week with another episode. Thanks a lot, y'all.